So today is entitled WordPress Plugin Development 101, where 101 is the code that Americans, I think, primarily use for when you go to university, college, and you're going to do the first course in your first year. So this is supposed to be the basics of WordPress plugin development, which means writing plugins for WordPress. Now, we might find we're not actually doing the basics of WordPress plugin development when we get into the details of it, and that's because very quickly you find that you have to do something a bit more than you thought you were going to do. Go the right way. So we'll do it in 24 stages. First question we're going to ask is, what is WordPress? And then we're going to say, what is a plugin? What is a theme? Why would you want to use a plugin? Then we'll say, how does WordPress work? And how does a plugin extend WordPress? And then we get on to the point of this thing is what we will need to write a plugin, which plugin do we want to write and why? And then what do we need to know in order to write that plugin? Then we'll have a look at the requirements of this plugin that we're going to write and the solution that we've proposed for writing that. And then we'll get into the actual details of what the plugin consists of, which is a number of different files, and in this plugin, a number of different PHP functions. And we'll go through some of the plugin's code line by line, looking at PHP and stuff, but not necessarily all of it. Slide 19, other functionality, will skim over the other functionality of the plugin that we haven't covered so far. We'll have a brief discussion on how we can debug the plugin, how we can test the plugin, and how we can update the plugin when there are new versions. Finally, some pointers, links to WordPress reference and handbooks where you can read more about it, and then some more pointers to other places where you can read about plugin development and also theme development. So any link that we have in these slides will be shown with blue links like that plugin handbook and theme handbook link there. And you can also find this information on the wppomp.org.uk website, where a copy of these slides in PDF form are already uploaded to the site. And you should have received that information in the notification with the Zoom thing I told you about today. Everyone happy with that? Go the right way. So what is WordPress? Andrew's words are written in green here. Tell us.
Do you mean with a green background?
Yeah.
That works with it. WordPress is a platform that allows users to build professional looking websites very quickly without a lot of knowledge of what is happening behind the scenes. The user has to accept the advantages and the limitations of WordPress and the theme that they have chosen.
There you go. A nice simple explanation of WordPress. Looking at a more complicated way of viewing it as a plugin developer, WordPress is made up of lots of code written in a whole load of weird and wonderful languages called PHP and SQL and JavaScript, CSS, HTML and JSON. And these are all combined together using a thing called an application programming interface, an API. And there's an API that deals with users and their roles and capabilities, content, media, that's attachments, a custom post types you might have like events, taxonomies, categories and tags, comments, options, help, widgets, shortcodes, blocks, and so on. And the system can be accessed by users in a number of different ways. You access this website on the front end by just typing in a URL, or if you happen to be administrator or editor or something, you can log into the system and you can communicate through the admin and dashboard. And You may choose to edit content using a variety of different editors. The Gutenberg block editor, for example, or there might be an editor for your widgets or menus and all that sort of stuff. Each of these different ways of accessing the system has to be supported by WordPress, and each of these different things can be somehow extended so that if WordPress doesn't do what it's supposed to do, you could make it do that. So the WordPress source code is known as the core, and WordPress actually delivers a number of bundled themes like 2021 and also some bundled plugins, Akismet and Hello Dolly. And there are also other plugins which are known as must-use plugins, MU plugins, and drop-in plugins you may have seen. Now, we're not going to necessarily talk about must-use plugins and drop-in plugins, but we are going to talk about a plugin. So what is a plugin? Andrew?
Well, obviously, Herb is the professor here, and I'm like the idiot. So this is the idiot's idea of what a plugin is. And
you wrote these nice words. You tell them.
Plugin is a piece of code that is written by a highly skilled developer that extends or adds the functionality to core WordPress. The WordPress user should be able to install the plugin and use it without any knowledge of the coding involved in creating the plugin.
And I think that's nice, the fact that you should be able to use the plugin without knowing how it works. Unfortunately, if you try to write a plugin without knowing how it works, then you should probably not be releasing it to anybody, because if you don't know how your code works, how could you possibly fix it? So the technical bit, what is a plugin? It's something that responds to messages from WordPress, other plugins or themes, and it does it basically in two ways. One is to filter some stuff to alter content or behavior. Another one is to respond to actions. How the WordPress plugin developer achieves this is basically up to himself, so long as he follows the basic WordPress rules. You'll find that some plugins are extremely well behaved with regards to implementing their solution, and others misbehave and are bullies. And some of these big plugins like WooCommerce and Jetpack and so on think that they're the only plugin that's needed in the website, and they're going to do as much as they possibly can, even though there's absolutely no need for them to do that most of the time. Yes, you can have lots of plugins in your website, and the more you have, the slower it's going to go. Potentially.
Herb takes some of these plugins personally.
I take most plugins personally.
Yeah, I just wanted to explain that because everyone else will be totally confused by that concept.
If a plugin does the job you want it to do and it does it fairly quickly, then it's probably a good plugin. If it doesn't do the job you want it to do and it does it very slowly, then it's not a good plugin.
Exactly.
So that's what a plugin is. So what's a theme? Well, a theme also extends WordPress, and it's the thing that gives WordPress its look and its feel. But it behaves in the same way as a plugin, in that it responds to the messages that WordPress and other plugins issues, and it can hook into WordPress by doing this filtering stuff and responding to actions. But the difference between a plugin and a theme, I suppose, is that it provides templates and template parts, which are the bits that make WordPress display the content that you want to see in the form that you want to see it. So if you're looking at a home page which lists the blog posts, you might expect to see a title followed by the featured image, followed by the excerpt, and then maybe some metadata. And then you get on to the next post and so on. We just let Scott into the room.
It does feel sometimes there's a lot of crossover, but I think you're going to go into this later from your previous slides to say that there should be quite a lot of separation between what your theme is doing and what your plugin is doing. But I think you're going to cover that later, aren't you?
We might cover it on exactly the next slide, Chris. So you can only have one active theme, but it could actually be a child theme, which means you've effectively got two themes, the child theme and the parent theme, working together to make your website do what it wants to do. If you want to know more about themes, you can go and read Themes Getting Started, What is Theme? And you can also look at the template hierarchy, which is how a theme is constructed. So why would we use a plugin? And the answer is because WordPress or your theme or your existing set of plugins doesn't do what you want it to do. So Hello Dolly is an example plugin from WordPress core. It doesn't do what you wanted to do, because what you wanted it to do was to, when you're logged into the admin page, give you one line of the song Hello Dolly up in the top bar. Now, it's not a plugin that most people want to have running on their site unless they're trying to learn the words of the song in a random order or something. So, but that's an example of a plugin doing something. Now you can get these plugins from WordPress.org, in which there are 59,000 and something available to choose from, or you can get a free one from another site. That might be from another plugin developer's site, or he might take it from his GitHub repository or somewhere, or you can get a premium one from another site. For example, a version that you have which does a bit more than the free one you got from WordPress.org, or you can develop your own bespoke plugin. And the reason you develop it as a plugin rather than as a theme is because it makes more sense to do it that way. And that's a get out clause. It's because it would be, as a professional person developing software, you'd say, I think the best place to put that piece of code is in a plugin. That answer your question, Chris? Will answer your comment?
Yes.
Right. So how does WordPress work? Now, we could ask, how does your car work? And we could say, well, you get into the car, you put the key into the socket, you turn the socket and the car starts up. And then someone would say, well, no, that's not quite right, because when you put the key into the socket and then you turn it, that causes some electricity to do something, and that electricity goes down here, and that causes a motor to start turning, and that motor starts, and it also causes some other thing to get fuel to go through here, and we're not talking about electric cars, and so on and so forth. And so I'm going to give you the rather long explanation for how WordPress actually starts up, because we have to have some understanding if we're going to be able to write a plugin to be able to see how the whole thing works. So here we go. WordPress responds to requests from the browser and or bots and or other systems. So for example, if we go to example.com, when that is visited and a website is decided to be approached and say, come on, show us your output from example.com, it may then go into the Apache web server, which is then instructed by WordPress that on that request, we're going to invoke a routine called index.php. Index.php is a very small file that contains a bit of code that basically loads up another file called wp-blog-header.php. And that loads up another file called wp-config, it doesn't, wp-load.php, which loads up another file called wp-config.php. And if you've ever set up your WordPress website, you'll know that that contains some stuff about where the database is and some other different things, some constants. And eventually, after setting up these constants, that loads wp-settings.php, which loads up most of WordPress's source files. And it loads up things called must-use plugins. And it loads up the activated plugins that are activated in your multi-site network. If you happen to be a WordPress multi-site site, then it loads up your activated plugins. And as it's doing all this, it keeps on firing out these things called action hooks or invoking filters. And an example of one of those is setup theme, which is actually called before your theme is loaded up. And I don't know what you're supposed to do in response to that. And then when loading the active themes functions.php file, it loads up the child themes file, and then it loads up the parent themes file. And when the theme has been loaded up, then invokes this action called after setup theme. And you can respond to that, and closely followed by init, and then we get WP loaded. And when that's done, WP blog header calls WP, which loads up the WP includes template loader, which then tells the theme to go and do certain stuff. And so it goes on. And all the way it runs these things, database queries and action hooks and filters. And finally, you get some output. And the user says, I didn't want to look at that. I want to go to another page, and it goes through it all over again. And somehow along the lines, plugins have to sit in there and respond to all these different things that are happening in a certain way to behave the way that WordPress works. Nice and simple, wasn't it?
Seems amazing that any pages get shown at all, doesn't it?
I think so, yes. Hello.
Have you shouted or something?
Yeah, we're on it.
Who's good at this?
No. Wife's come into room.
She's lives.
No, I'm just going. So, what is this thing called hooks, filters, and actions? How does a plugin extend WordPress? Now, this is probably the details. It contains some PHP here, and it shows two different ways that WordPress can be extended by a plugin. Filters. A filter will change the value of something, and that's its job. So it's given some information and maybe a bit of context. Its job is to return either the same information or some modified version of the information. Then there's an action, which is to do something when something else has happened. Now, so filters, you could have a filter like a tea strainer, which filters the leaves out of your tea. Or you could have an oil filter or an air filter in the car, and those do things to take out the badness. Or you could have a filter which is a gold panning dish, which filters out the good things and puts away the badness. That's the sort of thing what a filter does. Whereas an action is something like a fire alarm. So when a smoke detector detects some smoke, then it makes a bell ring, and that causes you, the human being, to think, oh, there's a fire, I best get out. And it may also cause the lifts to go to the ground floor and all that sort of stuff. In programming terms, a filter example is this thing on the left. On the invocation, we might want to filter the title of some content which is being displayed, and we allow other routines to change this title. So we invoke a PHP function called apply filters. We say the filter that we want to apply is title, and we pass in the value of the title that we want to display. And the filter functions have to return the same or a different version of the filtered title. Having got that filtered title, we can then go and do something with it. For example, echo it to the screen. Now, the way we implement our filter function is to tell WordPress that we want to add our own function called the title filter to hook into the filter called the title. And it will receive the parameter that's passed in, and it will do its magic, and it will return the results. And in this very simple example, all it does is it takes any E and replaces it with 2 E's. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Good. Actions and filters are basically the same, except that in terms of implementation, except that an action doesn't return a value. But they're different in that an action can do a lot more stuff to provide lots more different output and things happening. A simple example of an action that you might hook into, and then most plugins do, is to hook into the init action, which is run after all the plugins have been loaded, and after WordPress has been loaded, and after the theme's been loaded, and after whatever else we saw. And one of the standard things that WordPress does is has a function called smileys init, which is invoked with a priority of 5, which means it's run earlier than the priority of 10, which is the default priority, and therefore gets a chance to do something before other things do. And in WordPress, smileys init, its function sets up a thing called a smiley, which is some strings that can be translated to something more fun for the user to look at. So if you happen to type into your content Mr. Green : then what you'll actually see when that gets processed as a smiley is that little smiley green man down below. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So there are variations on how filters are applied and how actions are applied, but
Sorry, can I ask a question about priorities?
yes.
That's totally up to the developer, is it?
Yes, you decide the priority in which you want to respond to something. For example, when you're filtering content using the content filter, you might think, I want everybody else to have done all their stuff before I do my bit. Or you might think, I need to get there first. And so you can set a priority to a higher value or a lower value. A very low value would be minus 9,999, and a very high value would be 9,999. Probably don't find people using smaller or bigger numbers than that. If you set it to the same value as another filter, then or action, then the sequence is basically in the order in which the plugin or theme added that action at that priority. That make sense?
Yes, thank you very much.
So with actions happening, it probably doesn't matter the sequence in which they're being run, but with filters, it can very much be important. One example is automatically inserting paragraphs into content. Some routines want to have the paragraphs added later, and others want them to be added earlier. And in many cases, you don't want them added at all. So what we haven't talked about here is not only can you add filters, you can also remove filters. And if you have the capability of adding and removing, you can actually go and change the priority. You can move them around so they happen in different orders. Were you going to say something?
I think some of this comes back to what you were saying earlier. In that some plugins are bullies and some aren't. In that, if you change the order of things, you could stomp all over some other plugin that's working that you need.
some plugins might be bullies because they happen to implement filter functions which are used very, very many times, but aren't expected to go off and perform an awful lot of processing. And so they can slow your site down badly if they happen to go and do that. So we want to write a plugin. Which plugin do we want to write and why? Andrew?
Oh, where am I? Okay, people have been talking to us about the speed and stuff of websites. And one of the things they said was you don't want to have too many plugins because they slow down your website. We don't know exactly how many is too many, but I've got about 40. If there's a clue there. So Herb wrote this plugin which can, well, before I say that, WordPress doesn't seem to me to be too clever, and so it loads all the plugins. If you've got 40 plugins, it loads them up for every page. It doesn't care whether that page uses that plugin. So Herb's written a plugin to where you can actually say, for this page, I'll only use these plugins. For this page, I'll use these plugins. And when we ran this thing, we found that this thing that you can see on the left-hand side of Herb's screen is actually a widget. Well, it was a widget, and it was part of the events calendar plugin. And if you disable the events calendar plugin, then this thing doesn't appear. And I put it in the widget area, which means it appears on every page. So that wasn't really so clever. So the answer to that was not to have the events calendar plugin loaded up for every page, but Herb thought he could try and write a plugin which would mimic this widget, but wouldn't involve having the events calendar plugin loaded. So now the events calendar plugin is only loaded on a handful of pages, which is where the most of it is used. And this can appear on every page, but it hopefully doesn't impair the speed of the website. And what it's actually doing, the events calendar is a place where you can store and create and build upcoming meetings. And this little widget will just tell you what are the next 3 meetings coming up. And so you can see that on every page, and you can see, if you're interested, what you might like to do with us, with our society.
Good. So what should be a fairly simple bit of output to produce with a certain amount of CSS styling? Right. Now, what do we need to know in order to write a plugin? Well, I've listed these things sort of ordered in terms of, if you're a beginner, then you'll need to know those things on the left. If you're going to do some intermediate plugin development, then you might be getting involved in the next 21 items. And if you're going to do some advanced plugin development, then you're going to have to get involved in those different things. Now, the highlighted things in yellow are the things that we have in this plugin we have actually got involved in. So the first 8 items, 9, first 11 items, definitely important that we have to be able to write a plugin slug and a header and a README and know a bit about these things called shortcodes and hooks, filters and actions. We need to know about how to write PHP. We need to know about the CSS for styling. We need to know about HTML for formatting, writing, displaying content, and then some things to do with the WordPress APIs that we can use to make the system do what we want it to do. And because we happen to be working with a custom post type and so on. We need to understand post types and metadata and taxonomies because we're trying to replace some functionality that was previously provided by the events calendar. Now on the right hand side, we get to some complicated stuff where, because we want to make this site faster, we want going to have to do some processing with caching. Have I spelled caching wrong? And in order to do some caching and to save some data for up to 24 hours, say, we will need to be able to use these wonderful things called transients. So this is what this plugin is going to attempt to cover. Let's go and have a look at, so we saw what we wanted to do. Let's turn it into requirements. Here we got an example of the upcoming meetings widget that would appear when you're looking at that sidebar on the mobile or tablet view. So it's slightly wider than it was when we saw it at the left sidebar. So we need some styling which is responsive. We need to get this output displayed in the widget area, and we've got basically two sections. The meeting section, which shows up to 3 meetings ordered by ascending date and time, displaying the date, the meeting start and end time, and the meeting title, which acts as a link to the meeting itself. And at the bottom, we have a link to view the overall calendar. And the requirements are that it should be extremely efficient, and even when the events calendar plugin is activated or deactivated, it should continue to work properly. So when the events calendar plugin is activated, like when you're actually on an events page and this widget is being shown, it should still behave and look exactly the same as it did before. And in fact, the idea is this output will replace the widget on all the pages, because otherwise we have to fiddle about with deciding how you're going to display a widget sometimes and not other times. So the proposed solution is to develop this thing as a shortcode, because shortcodes can be used in the same way as widgets, and it's just a simpler way of doing it. And we're going to make it produce similar logic to the events calendar widget, but we're not going to have any JavaScript involved, which is what was used for the view calendar link. And we're going to use this things called transients to store the output that we've generated once, and we're going to use that so that it continue to display the same output until something changes. And we'll cache that output, but we also need the capability of making sure that the cached content is changed whenever it needs to. So we'll have some cache busting logic, and we're going to, for this widget, enqueue that amount of CSS that we need for this widget or shortcode, and we'll enqueue that in line as opposed to having it as a CSS file that's output on the page. And one reason for doing that is because it pleases Google's Page Speed Insights tool for Core Web Vitals. So it's nice to have it implemented as a widget, but since it won't have any parameters, not really necessary. We can just use the shortcode, and it's not nice to have it as a Gutenberg block because Andrew doesn't yet want to use Gutenberg blocks for widgets, and nor do EPPS people. So we're actually going to start writing the code. And the first thing I always write is a README file which describes the plugin. And a README file, WordPress has a particular format of the README file, readme.txt, which is documented in the third last link. And basically the only thing you need is the first line probably, and the rest of it just assumes. Here we have a README file which says that both Andrew and I are the contributors to this plugin. If you wanted to donate to support the plugin, then you can go to the eBPS website and click on their donate link, and you can support eBPS. It is tagged as being for eBPS, which stands for British Pteridological Society. What's the E for?
Well, we had a big debate about whether it should be an E or an I, but basically it's to sort of say this is the online side of the society, like iPhone. Is it like iPhone?
iPhone, yeah. I don't know why it's called an iPhone. Right, so we have requires at least, so it needs WordPress 5.8.2 and it's tested up to WordPress 5.8.2, and the stable version of this plugin is 0.4.1. Now this is information that we put onto a plugin if it was going to go into the WordPress.org repository. When you're choosing a plugin from the WordPress.org repository, if it's tested up to version 2.9, it's probably not a very good plugin to choose, because WordPress is now nearly 5.9. There's no code in this. It's a description of the plugin and how it works and how to install it, and any other marketing stuff you want to do, or explaining people how to necessarily use it. So we haven't really written very much yet. Let's move on. We're going to write the plugin itself. So we need to generate a file, and we've chosen that we're going to call this plugin eBPS-meetings, and we're going to put that in our plugin folder called eBPS meetings. And the slug for the plugin, which is the short name for the plugin, I suppose, is eBPS meetings, and the main file that we're going to implement for this is exactly the same in that eBPS meetings in the folder eBPS meetings. And at the top of the plugin, the only thing we really need is the plugin name. This is written as part of a PHP comment, but WordPress and PHP itself has the capability of actually looking at comments and making use of that information at times. So some of this information is useful for both the plugin and WordPress core and WordPress.org uses this stuff. So when you've installed the plugin and activated it, or when you've installed it, the description that you've written there in third line down to replace the upcoming events widget is what will actually be seen when the person looks at their list of plugins. So we have a bit of PHP that starts less than question mark PHP, and then a block comment written using WordPress standard styling. So we get on to the code itself. And what we wanted to do is we wanted to implement a shortcode. And the way we achieve that is we, first of all, say we need to respond to some certain messages that come from WordPress. And the first one we want to respond to is the init message. And here we're going to implement our function called eBPS_init. And we're going to do it with a priority of 100, which is later than all the other plugins. And the reason we do that is just in case the events calendar is actually doing its stuff. So add action init eBPS init with a priority of 100 tells WordPress that when you invoke the action init, you're going to have to run this function called eBPS init, which is a callback function. In the function eBPS init, we use part of the WordPress API that says, right, I need to add this thing called a shortcode. The shortcode being eBPS-meetings, and my callback function for that is eBPS_meetings_shortcode. When someone codes the shortcode in the content or in the widget areas, then this is the function that's going to get invoked. We can't see that function yet. Now, we also need to do some other different things, and in order to achieve that one, we're going to actually do this using a file in a subfolder called includes, which contains more code than we need to have in the main file. So we are now going to have to load up this file by using require once, telling it comes from the current directory, and within there we're going to find it in the includes directory, and the file is called ebps tribe events.php. And then from that file we'll invoke a couple of functions, both of them which will maybe register something. First one registers the taxonomy for ebps events, and the second one registers an event itself. Then the next piece of code finds out whether or not the filter called widget text already has a function called do shortcode associated with it. And if it doesn't, we're going to have to add it, because we're going to put a shortcode into a widget, and sometimes shortcodes aren't processed normally automatically by widgets. So here is a piece of code that adds in the capability of doing that. So that's probably a 201 or a 301 logic there. Now, how do we get all this functionality to work? Well, at the end of the file, we have this simple line of code, ebps_loaded, which directly invokes the function called ebps loaded. So when WordPress loads up our plugin, ebps meetings, basically the main file will be loaded up and parsed by PHP, and then it will invoke ebps_loaded, which says, right, two things. When you call the init action, I've got this thing to do. And the other one is when you call the tribe event save action, there's this thing to do. And we'll cover that a bit later on. Happy? So we'll have a look at this shortcode. Shortcode is a function which takes 3 parameters. The first parameter is an array of attributes, which are the parameters to the shortcode. The second parameter is a string of content, which might be the content you write in between the start of a shortcode and the end part of a shortcode. And the third parameter is the name of the shortcode that's being invoked, because you could have the same function implemented for multiple shortcodes. In this particular case, ebps_meetings is a shortcode that hasn't got any parameters. So the ATTS array will be empty, the content will be empty, and the tag will be ebps_meetings. Now, we don't actually need to do anything until this shortcode is used in our content. Therefore, there's no point having all of the PHP loaded up. So we'll defer that until later. So here again, we're going to not make the functionality available until it's actually needed. So we load it up from another file, and having loaded up from another file, we then invoke that function. A shortcode doesn't echo content to the page. It has to return content to WordPress, and therefore it must always return HTML. So we invoke the lazy function to run that and return the HTML to the calling routine. So the included plugin file, which we're not going to look at in much detail of, is called includes ebps tribe events, and it contains the code to expand the shortcode. It's lazy loaded, and in this plugin, everything starts with ebps_. So it's our unique prefix. We've done this because it's easier for a starting plugin to do than trying to use namespaces and or object-oriented classes. And we're going to try to write the code so that it conforms to some font standards. WordPress has lots of standards which you can follow, and each function should also have a thing called a dot block, which we saw in that one there, implements the eBPS meetings shortcode and some special tags starting with an amount sign. And where possible, if you're going to write some WordPress stuff, you should actually make use of WordPress APIs. Or as Andrew put it, I used to tell him all the time when he was writing stuff, make it WordPressy. And as we always say, there's a function for that. So when you're writing a plugin, the thing to do is to look to see if there's already something that does the bit of logic that you want it to do. So we'll move on to this lazy implementation of the shortcode. And the first thing we want to do is to enqueue the CSS that we're going to use to style the HTML output that's generated. And we'll look at that later maybe. And then the next thing we're going to do is we're going to say, right, have I already saved the output that I'm supposed to be displaying here? And it'll use this function called eBPS get cache meetings. And if that returns some HTML, then that's okay. That's all we need to return. If not, we're going to have to generate this HTML by calling the eBPS meetings render HTML and then save that to cache it. So we have some functions to run. So the HTML rendering function will say, okay, my job is to go and get this. First of all, it needs to go and find out what these 3 events are that are coming up. Then it's got to write some HTML, and for each of the different events, write out the unique HTML that's needed to return. So we have a function called eBPS meetings upcoming events, which would take the list of events that's been returned and produce the relevant HTML output. And then finally, we're going to add the link that enables us to view the calendar. All of that information is returned to the calling routine, which is returned to the shortcode, which then puts that out in our widget area. So how do we go and get the upcoming events? Well, this is where we're going to use a WordPress function called get posts, which is an interface to the database. We don't have to write any MySQL stuff ourselves. We can just make use of a very powerful function called get posts, which will get the data for us. First thing we want to do is to find out what today's time is, what the current time is. So we use a WP_date function to get that one. And then we say, can we get please up to 3 posts which are of custom post type tribe_events and which have post metadata called event end date _event date with a value which is greater than or equal to the current time, and get 3 of them and order them by that value of the time in ascending order. That args array is passed to the get post function, and that returns the array of events. And whatever we get back, be it an empty array or up to 3 different events, then gets returned to the eBPS get upcoming by eBPS upcoming events to the routine we're going to call next. And so it goes on, and we write some code to do different things. Now, I haven't shown you all of the code that will generate all the HTML for the output events because it's just HTML is generated, but what we chose to do was write it so it almost exactly matched what the events calendar did. By doing that, all we had to do was then duplicate the CSS the events calendar used, which made it a bit simpler, but it's still some rather complicated output. We also didn't write any output. The events calendar does for the JSON_LD data, which is some schema stuff that may or may not be good for SEO. But since there is an events page that contains it all, it didn't seem necessary to put it on every single output page. Now, if you wanted to have a look at the further into the source code for this, then you'll find a number of different functions to register the tribe events cat taxonomy, and another one to register the tribe events custom post type and associate that to the custom taxonomy. And there was a good reason for doing that. Why we had to do that, I can't remember exactly what it was. Oh, it was to do with menu items that needed to be satisfied. So there was some functionality that enabled Andrew's menus to work correctly. There's another function to enqueue the CSS, and then we have the two functions to deal with caching, getting and saving the cache meetings. And now this last function is a very simple one. That is the one that enables us to clear the cache whenever an event gets changed. And here we found a hook called tribe events event save, which is invoked whenever you are in the events calendar and you update an event. Because that is invoked, we can hook into that and we can tell it that what we've cached so far for the EPPS meetings shouldn't be saved anymore, and we can simply delete it. And by doing that, whenever the person next visits a page, it will say, I haven't got any cache data. I will therefore have to go and regenerate it. So I've written all the code. We've written all the code. How do we go about debugging it? Make sure it works. Well, there are a number of different ways of doing this, and most people, depending on how old they are or how experienced they are, will just try to debug it as they're developing it. They'll write a bit of functionality and they'll see if it works, and then they'll move on. Not many people write the whole thing in one shooting match and then test it all. Now, I always do it in a local development environment. Other people might do it in the staging environment. And I also always do it with a constant called WP debug set to true. And this is something which is defined in the WP config.php. And more often than not, I also set script debug to true. On the right hand side there, you can see basically the bits of code I have in my config.php file to set those things. And in addition to setting WP debug to true, I also tell it that I want to log the output in the PHP error log, and I also want to display the output on the screen. So if anything goes wrong, even just a notice that some PHP variable hasn't been initialized, then I want to be told about it so I can fix it. Now, a person who is using a PHP debugger may be able to do debugging a lot faster than somebody who is not. But I prefer not to use a debugger because I actually use a tracing plugin that I myself have written called oicbw trace. But if you can't use xdebug or my trace function, you may find that using Query Monitor will help you understand what is going on when something doesn't work. What you have to try to do is to avoid using things like echo or print_r or var dump to analyze what's going wrong, because there'll be many times when doing that causes other things to go wrong because of the way WordPress actually works. When it happens to be a simple front-end functionality, it might be okay to do. But when it's something that you're writing which is going to be working in the back end and respond to an AJAX request or a REST API request or just the editor, then echoing your output is going to mess things up. What some people would say is you don't actually go and debug it, you write tests, PHP unit tests or other forms of tests, which will test its functionality as you develop it. So you both write the code and you write the tests at the same time. That means you might end up with twice as much code as you started off with, but you wanted, but you know that basically your logic has been fully tested. Another way of doing it is you don't actually debug it. You get someone else to look at your code and review it, and they will do the debugging for you in a peer review. Or you could just write your code to be perfect first time round and you won't need to debug it at all.
Nice to end on a fairy tale. It's nice to end on a fairy tale.
But it is Christmas.
True.
An IBM story about a function called IEFBR14, which is a simple assembler routine that had one piece of code it needed to do was to branch to register 14. Turns out that one line of code had 2 bugs in it. It's not easy to write debugged code. So we've sort of debugged it and we've got some output. How do we go about testing it? Well, as we said, we could use PHP unit, so we could formally test the logic, or we could just run it and compare the output we get from the new plugin with the output we were getting in the live system. And so here is 2 screen captures. The one on the left is the original widget, and the one on the right was the shortcode, as we can see with the title upcoming meetings shortcode. And we can compare the output in 2 ways. I compared both the HTML that was generated by doing view source and also compared it visually with the CSS. So it's not far off. I think we've made a change now so that the capitalization and the link colors are the same. And the other thing we wanted to do was to make sure that it actually did help us make the website faster. So I ran a routine I've written from my tracing logic and then compared the output using another routine, and I can demonstrate that with the events calendar, that which is the red chart, it's basically taking 0.3 of a second longer per request to do it with the events calendar than it is without the plugin. And then if you didn't have the plugin either, then the system would run slightly faster still. But then of course it wouldn't produce any output. And we also had a look at page speed insights to see how well the system performed with the replacement routine. And before, mobile was at a speed of about 73 to 80, and afterwards it has got better, 81 to 90, but there was not much we could see on the desktop because desktop was running faster. The mobile is probably just slowed down by the CSS that was there before, and also the JavaScript, and a little bit of JavaScript might be running as well. It's no longer there. So we've now written a plugin and we need to change it and produce a new version. And how do we do that? Well, we create in WordPress, you can create a zip file which you can upload and install, and now since WordPress 5 point something or another, you can replace an existing plugin with a new version. So we'll just do that. Zip it all up, including the README text and the PHP and the CSS opus and any other assets, and upload to the dashboard. Or another way you can do it, if you happen to be technically minded and have your system installed in a certain way, is you can actually just have a brand new version installed directly from the GitHub repository. I haven't done it that way. So that was basically it. We've developed a plugin, didn't show you all of the source code, but talked a bit about action hooks and filters and important things like that, and APIs. And if you want to read more, then you can look at each of these different resources, all from WordPress.org or developer.wordpress.org. Now, one of the things that some people suggested was very important about plugin development is you need to consider the security of your system. And there is lots and lots written about that in the section on security of capabilities of users and what they can and cannot do. You have to validate input and you have to sanitize input and output. And if you have any forms, you have to use marvelous things called nonces to check that the user is filling in the form that you've really given him to fill in and not just making it all up. So that's something which is important to learn as well if you're going to provide something which is dealing with users' input. And if you have read about plugins, you could also read about themes from the theme handbook. There are quite a few tutorials which you can find on plugin development. Pippin's plugins introduction, which he wrote a few years ago, is quite good. If you want to develop WordPress plugins and themes, then there are a number of different books to read, and the number one in that book is called WordPress Professional Plugin Development. What's it look like, Andrew?
Glad you asked me that question. Which one is it? Plugin development.
Is it by Brad? Yeah, closer.
You know, it disappears.
All right.
But
What's the title of it?
can you read it? WordPress plugin development.
There you go. I highly recommend that. I read it a couple of times before I passed it over to Andrew. How long ago?
5 years ago.
No, not that one. No, don't recommend that one so much.
Yeah.
And there are also some quite useful blogs, and one of which is written by Mark Wilkinson from High Rise Digital, and it's basically a very good description of hooks, actions, and filters.